Do we need more chairs? I'll yell. Couple more chairs.
Louder.
There's a couple more chairs.
The chair's not for you. I can hear
Where's okay, no seriousness. Can y'all hear me back there in the comfortable seats? Okay. Okay.
You want us to relay for you?
Yes. Do we have a microphone? Okay, well, y'all just be extra quiet, and then I'll be louder. So, how about that? So we wanted to have this to get a bunch of people together, let y'all meet each other. Did everybody meet somebody new? Raise your hand if you met somebody new. Okay, you that didn't meet anybody, you need to turn around and meet your neighbors, shake your hands, stuff like that. And talk about some of the things we do have coming up. So instead of talking about that, wasting no time with that, we just gave you a piece of paper with a lot of the events we're doing from the meetup group, and then a lot of the events that are going around Dallas or some kind of events that might pertain to you or you want to know about. If you know of some other ones, email me, tweet me, whatever you want to do, whatever you want, and Gmail or on Twitter, whatever that is. And then we'll post them out there and get that out, but just let me know if there's anything coming up. Does anybody have any questions about the meetup, about anything that's going on, anything like that?
How frequent is this going to be?
Meetups?
Yeah, how frequent?
So we meet on the second Thursday of the month and the last Wednesday of the month. Second Thursday is up here in this area, the CA building, just down the road. We may have some here, just where it works out best. Then we also have down at the improving location, which is in Addison. And that's kind of by design. So people that are going north from here, people that are closer down south, and in that area, you can go there. Either way, come to both if you're not sure. Great question, Mr. Cole.
I said Addison's down south.
We're almost in Oklahoma, so. Any other questions about the meetup? We'll talk more afterwards, and we'll do prizes and stuff. So make sure you have your raffle ticket. Don't throw it away. We've got some good prizes. So this is my curious question. J. Paul Reed? What's the point of the J? I'll let you maybe talk about that.
There's a story about J.
Okay.
J. Paul, hey
Okay.
you, hey
So
shithead.
I've actually heard him speak a couple times at DevOps Days in Austin. So that's on the paper, so you have to go back to that this year. Are you going back?
I'm planning to, yeah. I'm planning to.
And at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, which was in San Francisco last year, both are really good. And so I reached out to him, saw some presentations he was doing, and said, "Hey, you want to come talk to us in Dallas?" And a few minutes later, I was like, "Sure, I'll be there." I was like, "That sounds great. That's the guy we need." So I did talk to some other people. They were like, "I don't know," stuff like that. So, and they weren't going to be as good anyways. So that's why I'm here. So
No pressure.
yeah, I'm gonna quit talking because I'm boring, and we'll let J. Paul Reed kick it off.
All right. Awesome. Well, it's great to be here. I will try to project. I'm always told that I'm loud, and I often use my inside voice. If you can't hear me in the back, like raise your hand or jump up and down, and I will remember to project a little more if I get quiet. But I will try to be loud. So Jeremy wanted me to talk a little bit about where DevOps is going, where it's going in 2016. So we had some back and forth conversations via email about like, well, what would that look like? What would be interesting for you all to spend talking about that? And so this presentation may not seem like it's about where DevOps is going, the future of DevOps, but as we go through it, I think one of the things that it points out and that I hope you take away from it is that it's really getting you to pay attention to where DevOps in your own organization is going. And it walks you through some things to pay attention to. So hopefully at a micro level of what DevOps is day to day in your environment, that will be helpful there. After this presentation, I am going to do kind of pundit 2016 predictions. I'm going to do a post, and so you get to preview the post and then discuss. I've got 3 predictions for 2016 related to DevOps. So after this presentation, we'll do that, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussion. So, who am I? This slide is really about my Twitter name. Jake Horley on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, you can tweet things at me during or after the presentation. That's really cool. My background is actually in build and release engineering. That's how I came to the sort of DevOps party, as it were. And I am a consultant now for the last few years. And I've gotten to work with all sorts of organizations in different industries and different parts of the country. I am based, full disclosure, I'm based in San Francisco. A lot of my clients are in New York and New Jersey, but I grew up in Colorado and in Montana, so I don't consider it a flyover country. And I have some friends on the coast that do stuff sometimes, and I'm like, what are you doing? You know, that's weird. So I always really enjoy where I was working up in Boise, Idaho in December, which is kind of a cold country of Boise, but I always find that the things that people are dealing with, especially in the data part of the country, technology stuff, especially in Colorado where I grew up, just amazing. And the way that they're coming to DevOps stuff is really interesting to me. So, podcasts. If you are a podcast, you should show. Those are my posts that make the show really great. Should Show podcast on Twitter and theshipshow.com if you are a podcast person. So, it's kind of a gimmick, but I like to do it. I like to ask my audience a little bit about them. So put your hand up if you would consider yourself a developer. Okay, put your hand up if you would consider yourself an ops person. Okay. Put your hand up if you would consider yourself QA or release engineer. Okay, cool. How about the business? The business. You business people? Any others? Did I miss any other groups? No? Okay. Architect? Okay. I will add that to the list to ask next time. So second part of the survey, everyone get out a writing utensil or the notes app on your phone. Let me do a little exercise. I promise I'm making you do this because we will come back and I will have you look at it. So what I'd like you to do is write down the first words that come to your mind when you hear or see the word DevOps. It'll take about 30 seconds. A couple of you. Okay, so set that aside. We will come back to it. We'll go over why I asked that question. So last October was DevOps' 6th birthday. And so I was kind of, Patrick Dubois coined the word in Belgium 6 years ago at the first DevOps days. So it's been quite a journey. And I was sort of thinking back on 6 years and what you would expect out of something that is 6 years old. So I did what most people do a little bit. I did the kind of Google suggestion thing. So my 6-year-old is mean, my 6-year-old is driving me crazy, my 6-year-old is stealing, and my 6-year-old is being easy. Does anyone feel like this is driving you off? They're driving you crazy. Maybe. It's interesting. As DevOps matures, one of the really big questions has become, can we do DevOps in the enterprise? CIO journal seems to say, no, we can't do that. We can't do DevOps in the enterprise yet. It's interesting to note this article was May 13th of 2014. And then, of course, you've got other people saying, well, the results are in, enterprise DevOps was real. That was a big focus of 2015. DevOps Enterprise Summit really took off in 2015. And there were a lot of case studies that maybe we can do DevOps in the enterprise, the way that we conceive of DevOps at startups and smaller scale. Kind of the irony of this article, that it was dated June 5th of 2014, which is the same year in 2014. It was sort of this interesting, like, no, we can't do DevOps in the enterprise, and like a month later, yes, we can, it's totally real. And I think the data in 2014 is still kind of out on that. But in any event, it's almost like DevOps is sort of growing up. And of course, what do you do as a child grows up? You send it to school. So I did that experiment again with Google. My kindergartner doesn't listen in school, is being bullied, is crying at school, is exhausted. Do these describe DevOps? Being bullied by the enterprise, by the constraints of the enterprise and regulated industries and things like that. Kind of interesting to consider. So Baron Schwartz wrote an article at the beginning of 2015 as these conversations were going on, talking about the DevOps identity crisis. And he argued that DevOps needs a manifesto. But he also pointed out that the DevOps community steadfastly refuses defining it or giving it a manifesto. In some sense, they don't want to make the same mistake that was made with Agile, right? The Agile manifesto, right? And so there's this sort of inherent conflict that you don't want to define it, but if you don't define it, then how can you talk about it? Mike Lucides, an editor at O'Reilly, kind of defined it as the negative space. I'm not trying to find DevOps if you movement that doesn't want to do it, which is kind of an interesting way to sort of make an anti-definition. Patrick Swa, as I mentioned, coined the word 6 years ago. He's often called the godfather of DevOps. This tweet was dated April 25th of 2014. I find it interesting, like, I think I'm slowly after DevOps and moving into the philosophy of IT. So I wonder if it would caught on this quickly, called it philosophy of IT as opposed to DevOps. But even he's sort of thinking about tinkering with the name. Imagining that before when you decide to name DevOps like you did. It's interesting to note, it's somewhat apt that, if you know the story of Hudson and Dickens, the reason it was renamed is because Oracle acquired it as part of the Sun acquisition. They didn't trust Oracle with the copyrights and the trademarks to restrict them, so they built it for code and renamed the project. So it's kind of funny that he would suggest that in the same breath as DevOps and sort of enterprise vendors and enterprise DevOps. So 6 years in, we're experiencing some tension. We have this manifesto, not no manifesto kind of dichotomy. Like, do we define it? How can we know what it is if we don't define it? Is it just one of those I'll know it when I see it sort of things? So this is kind of the source of the tension. Like, obviously, a lot of companies want to scale DevOps up and out, and they want quick solutions, right? They want DevOps in a box or DevOps certification kits. You can buy this at Amazon. It was $300 when it came out. I think it's now like $80. I saw this when I was searching for something else. You literally could download DevOps, and it was a product. It did something. I don't know what it did because I didn't download it. I didn't want that on my machine. But they want to replicate it. What they really want are the so-called unicorn companies. They want to replicate that behavior, replicate that success. Who's familiar with the term unicorn companies? And it's interesting because I've asked this question in Tel Aviv and in Germany, and in Tel Aviv they weren't as familiar with it, and in Germany their conception of what I think of as unicorn companies and what most people when I ask that question is very different. So it's interesting in this level setting that people have heard that term. So unicorn companies and unicorns come from this distinction between the horses and the unicorns. Chris Little said, "In all horses may be confused with the unicorns." Dean Kim likes to say unicorns are just trained horses. When I hear the term unicorn companies, I often think of this. Just munching away on some cash there, fat and happy. So what are some of the unicorn companies? Shout them out. Netflix, GitHub, Etsy, Amazon, Uber, Google. Cool, we're on the same page here. Did you guys see this before? Are you cheating? All right, those are the popular ones. There are some that you might not have heard of. This is a report I wrote for Ryan called DevOps Impact. It's a story of Nordstrom and their DevOps journey. And also actually Texas.gov, their own state government is doing some really interesting stuff in the DevOps space. And this tells the story of both of those. Jez Humboldt likes to say unicorns are just horses we've got to publicly. So, these mythical DevOps creatures. How many people tried to take techniques from one of these companies and apply it to their organization? How'd that work out for you? What? The monkeys work? Yeah? Has anyone ever had to look how Netflix does DevOps conversation with their team? We should do it like that. And it seems like, yeah, I get it. You might have that experience? It's a very common problem. So I wanted to actually kind of go back to basics when we're talking about DevOps, right? Because a lot of times we pattern match against the unicorn companies that we all kind of know. We think of chaos monkeys, right? We think of what Facebook is doing, some of the like IT and infrastructure, like hardware infrastructure stuff, Google too. So I went back and I asked 50 people that we could, I hate the term thought leader, but we could describe them as DevOps thought leaders. The same exact question that I asked you. In your DevOps, what words pop in you? And this is what they said. So a couple of words kind of stand out there, don't they? Culture, empathy, collaboration. How many people had one word on this list? How many people had two? How many people had three? Okay. So there are some funny ones on here that are kind of small. There's oh no, right there. Right, bullshit is on there. I don't know where it is, but yeah, somebody found it. Enterprise corruption is probably actually one of my favorite ones on there. And there's also SI. There is SI. They do a lot of research. Right? So why did I ask them this? Why did I ask you this? Why did I have you take 30 seconds and write down your kind of immediate thoughts? Well, language is important, right? Dave Snowden. Anyone know Dave Snowden? He came up with the Benevolent complexity model, and a lot of thinking about DevOps and complex systems comes from something that was done with the Benevolent model. It's a really interesting model. But he is an academic. He's a British or Welsh academic, actually, and so he pontificates about these things. But so he talks about language of description is the language of intervention. That is, for us to intervene or change a system that we are in, a company that we're working for, we need to be able to describe it. We need to be able to talk about it. So aesthetics, right? I had that in the title slide. Aesthetics. What does aesthetics have to do with anything, right? It's a standard that you do that. Major art, beauty, appreciation of beauty. So try to answer the question, what is beautiful? Sometimes they describe it as a study of sensory or sensory emotional values. So these are kind of some areas that are kind of interesting in terms of aesthetics, experimental aesthetics. Actually, that's the second oldest version or oldest area of psychology, which is kind of interesting to think about it. Back in the 1800s, they were trying to figure out that why when they see a painting, see it, hear a song, like it, or see a flower and relate to it, like psychologically what's going on. It actually started in Germany, this study of that. So neuroaesthetics, that's the idea that we could do those things. We could have you listen to a sonnet or Mozart's symphonies, and we can put you in a functional MRI and look at what your brain is actually doing as it reacts to those things. And of course, applied aesthetics, those are the ones that we all think about, right? Everybody heard the term foodies, right? TV, film, fashion, that sort of thing. What's interesting is one major area of study of applied aesthetics right now is actually source code, right? We all know, have you ever said, yeah, that source code was crappy? right? And then somebody's like, well, why? It works, right? And then even go through mathematical proof. It says, well, yeah, I can, with my algorithms class, it shows that it works, right? But it still looks ugly, right? There are actually academic researchers that are studying the beauty of code and why we as engineers find it ugly or pleasing aesthetically. One of the other areas that was real big, which I found interesting, web browsers. Because web browsing was such a new technology in the late 90s, they did a lot of like aesthetic research on browser layouts and like how users found them to use and that sort of thing. So we could spend a whole lot of time on this. But I want us to think about aesthetics in the context in which that we work, which is the operational environment, right? So when you look at other operational fields, I talk a lot about aviation in my talks, partly in control, but also in pilot. This is Haneda Airport in Tokyo. So as you look at the operational environment, you begin to see patterns emerging, right, in that complex system that you have. Certain things are chaotic. Certain things are more ordered. Back and forth in these systems. It's a symphony of agents in an environment using tools to deal with external forces. And of course, things are creep, right? You have a process, if you don't know why you do it, but it's just that's the way to do it. This process is a creep. Like you see it. So that may be interesting, but a friend of mine described this as there's beauty in things like that. So when we talk about aesthetics, we talk about DevOps, kind of this idea that things done well is beautiful. So back to the unicorns. So we've all heard Facebook likes this phrase, right? Move fast and break things. Right? That was their mantra for a number of years. Now, a lot of people, when they see this, they say, wait, they changed it, right? So now it's move fast with stable infrastructure. I'm not sure I believe that, but that's what they say. That's what they say they believe in, right? You can't tell developers no. This comes from Phil Bibowitz. There's been a number of talks about configuration languages. He's an infrastructure engineer at Facebook, and he tells a story that one of their things is that you really can't tell developers no. If a developer wants to change the sysctls on a fleet of machines at the Linux kernel level, they have to find a way to do it. No is not a valid response at Facebook to a developer that wants to do that. And so a couple of the talks he has actually talk about how they had to support that use case and what they did to do that. To basically grant keys to every configuration tweak in the entire stack to any developer. Right? How do you manage that chaos? I think probably a lot of operations engineers are probably going, wow, I didn't have to do that. That would just be a total mess. Let's talk about Netflix. What are some of Netflix's aesthetics? They're very popular ones. They have a lot of that, but I don't know if I would call that an aesthetic. Although it's interesting to consider what their aesthetics prompted them to do that, right? That's an outcome. In fact, that's a great example. I'll come back to that. That goes right, you're like 10 minutes ahead. Oh my God. Yes. So what's in their culture deck? Freedom and responsibility, right? They have this big mantra of freedom and responsibility. And it's funny, I have a bunch of friends at Netflix, and they always laugh when people say this because they're like, yeah, everybody hears the freedom part, but they never hear the and responsibility part. In fact, one of the engineers there had a talk that he's been doing on the circuit about just the responsibility part, because everybody else hears the freedom part. Context, not control. It's the idea that you set context for your team, and that's more important than trying to control or micromanage them. Right? That's how they are able to sort of amplify their success, because they set context and control it. Right? You may have heard this one, adequate performance with the generous severance package. That is in their culture deck, and they make no qualms about that. If you're not working out, 29 days in, they will fire you. They will give you a 4-month severance package. That's the minimum, by the way. It's just up from 2 months. If you get it longer, they'll give you a longer severance package. But if you're not working out, they will talk through it with you, and they will get rid of you. So it's interesting, right? A lot of people think that's not a good way to handle things, but it is part of their aesthetic. What about Amazon? Well, data-driven always, right? We hear story after story about engineers there that projects and products that can't take off unless you have all the data supporting the use case for it. They collect a lot of data, right? So they do a lot of data analytics. And they spend a lot of time looking at data. Data leader who will enforce strategy. I sort of came up with this one, and I've debated it with people before. But this comes from, if you know the story of how Amazon switched to microservices, there's that famous Jeff Bezos memo, right? Where he says, you will do an API, you will do a service, it will be behind an API, I don't care what it is, you will not expose any internal implementation, right? And there's like 5 bullet points, right? One part of that story, oh, and the last bullet point is, if you do not do this, you will be fired. I have that person, but one part of the story that's kind of a footnote, he hired, I believe, an Army colonel, but it was someone high-ranking that was an ex-Army officer, to go around and ensure the teams would do that and report back to him if they wanted. Or maybe he didn't have the ability to buy it. But there was somebody who enforced that stuff. And then, of course, put in 4 years. I don't know if you saw the New York Times article. It was late last year about Amazon and some of their HR kind of things. And there were a lot of people in that article that had a lot of stories that kind of seemed, frankly, not so great. Their experience was not so great. Even the employees that had a good experience kind of were like, yeah, you've been here 4 years and you kind of burn out. And you're going to make a lot of money if you do that. At least that's what Amazon says, and that's how they treat it. So you kind of put in your 4 years. That's their setup. That's the way they kind of do things. So if you look at all these, this is really, what's notable about all of these is when we consider these successful unicorn companies, these are sort of their professed values, right? What they find beautiful in terms of running a company, these are all very different. There's some in common maybe with Amazon and Netflix, but for the most part, they're kind of different. So I said this at DevOps Days Rocky last year. Culture is not actually important, but cultural alignment is critical. I've actually changed that. I'm thinking on that. It's now cultural, not important, but shared aesthetic is critical. And the reason for that is that in complexity theory, I've been reading more about it. Dave Snowden talks about you actually don't want alignment in a complex system. Because if you have too much alignment, then you reduce the adaptive capacity of that system, right? So if everybody's sort of marching in formation, and then something like the iPhone happens, you actually can't get people to pivot fast enough to be drummed out all of the variations, right? You actually want any adaptive capacity in your system. You actually want a little bit. You don't want complete alignment. So what are your aesthetics of DevOps? So take a moment and think about this. Were they including any of the words you used before? What are your team's aesthetics of DevOps? What about your organization? Would you describe them as shared? Do you think when your CTO says, hey, DevOps, let's do the DevOps, and your partner, developer, or ops person says, hey, let's do DevOps, are they talking about the same thing? That's interesting to consider. So I surveyed, same question, those 50 people, and I picked out, there's about 6 of them. We're going to read through them. But what I want you to pay attention to as we read through them is how different they actually are. And these are, again, at the end, I showed you they are. You actually showed these things. But I find it fascinating that the variation in it. So one person said their aesthetic of DevOps is a deep collaboration. Okay. DevOps is a product, understanding the form the organization needs to learn from practice. So this is that kind of Toyota production system. Language. Holistic view of modern production is a complex process beyond tasks, effort, pride, and goal. Part of that is interesting. DevOps requires generosity and humility. Sharing is hard, especially when it's sharing is perfect. It's DevOps is beautiful with it. People together. They're very people-centric. Including the health and fitness of the whole organization from economic performance to employee satisfaction. I think this perspective is interesting because it is so business focused. It's only probably one reason. DevOps epitomizes the idea of empathy and cooperation that calls people to work together, breaking down silos. So I put this one in here specifically because often when you think about the humanity that exists behind code, how many times have you looked at code and said, who in the hell wrote this? This is garbage. And then how many times have you done an annotate and it's like it was used 6 months ago? I've done that. The amazing DevOps outcomes that we love so much, high daily deploys, high reliability, lack of friction, are what results when we keep pushing towards single piece flow, the theoretical ideal of lean manufacturing. So what's interesting about this one is the whole lean manufacturing thing, right? You've read the Phoenix Project. There's a lot of lean in there, right? Yes, you said that. Finally, DevOps at this juncture. That's their aesthetic of DevOps, which I think is pretty accurate. These are the people, I won't tell you who said what, but these are the people that provided this book. Some of the thought leaders. So let's talk about some commonly shared DevOps aesthetics. Automation, I think that's pretty well settled at this point. I don't think a lot of times we argue about whether or not you should automate things. When I started my career, we used to. Maybe getting my head against the wall a lot, and so now that's like not a conversation anymore. It's cool. Infrastructure as code. I think the jury's pretty much back on that. But that's a thing you should do if you want to succeed. Systems thinking and value streams. These are like value stream mapping and that kind of stuff. Call it, yeah, lean kind of thing, right? This idea is you got to look at the whole system. You got to map the whole system. Feedback loops, again, very important. How do you tighten those feedback loops to get more data quicker? Collaboration, empathy, big thing. Winning and recognizable improvement. I find it interesting that the subtitle of the Phoenix Project is like something I couldn't even remember, but it's like how to do blah 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 to make your business win. Right? The State of DevOps 2014 and 2015 report really are all about winning and recognizable improvement. That's kind of interesting. That's a shared step. So these are some that are perhaps more difficult to agree upon. Yeah, I just do that. Application architecture could be microservice. Could be Docker that go. Could be Java 8 or 9 or 12. I don't know. Who is allowed to say no? We don't always agree on who is allowed in a particular system to say no. Humanity and humane system design. So interesting thing about this one is a lot of times when you talk about, when you look at like Etsy and how they deal with probably, especially their ops team, if their ops team gets paid, they see that as a humane system. Right? If you get paid at 3 a.m., that's a inhumane system. Our system should not be doing that. And so the thing is, sometimes you're just going to have to get paid at 3 a.m. That's the goal, right? That's the job. But they take that very seriously and they react to it in a rather unique way, actually. And they do that system because they think it's a human system. Inclusivity and diversity. That's kind of a lot of conversations around DevOps. How we can make that. When to slow down. I think a lot of times people think, well, if we do the DevOps, that automatically means we're going to move faster, right? And there's no sort of consideration that we might have to actually slow down before we can speed up again. We might have to retool the way we do work as part of this whole DevOps journey, which implies the slow down. So elephant conversations. I call them these because, you know, these are the sort of elephants in the room, right? This is the quintessential elephant conversation. This is Shanley. I don't know how many of you know her. She does a lot of culture, like Matt, he talks about culture and fact, and he often says a lot of, I don't know if I want to say inflammatory, but people have strong reactions to the things he says of them. He said one true, our true culture is everywhere because no one will say culture about our dynamics and spoken for with all of these conflicts and forces and social relationships and distribution of that. This may seem rather stark or harsh, but have you ever been in a situation where it's like, hey, we're creating a DevOps team, or you're going to go do a DevOps thing, except it's not funded in any way. There's no money, there's no time, there's nothing. And that's exactly what she's speaking to. That there's often a conflict, like our true culture really is what gets funded. You can say no, right? What stories does the organization tell itself about itself? Right? What do we tell new hires about the organization? This is asshole rule. Have people heard of the no asshole rule? You want to read it? Yeah, I suggest you read it. If you haven't, it's a great book. One of my favorite parts of the book is like, I think it's in the first section, talks about why you shouldn't call it the no, cuckoo facing rule or whatever, like why you had to say asshole rule. The next single question for testing organization character, what happens if people make mistakes, right? This speaks to what is your team or company's aesthetic regarding failure? Do you find the person that made a mistake and fire their ass? Or do you treat that as a learning opportunity about for the team, for the company, something about your system? So I want to take a very small digression on loose taxonomy because I think they're really relevant to the discussion. This is John Lewis at DevOps in Chicago. He talks about the fact, talking about where DevOps is going. He made the argument that loose taxonomies and NICE are going to continue living on. They're one of the best ways to sort of talk about it. So a lot of people, when they talk about DevOps, what's the first thing they say? Tools and culture, right? Tools and culture. Culture and tools, tools and culture. Tools and tools and culture and culture and culture. This is a book by Mandy Wall's report on DevOps tools and culture from back in April 2013. I would submit to you that use the original loose taxonomy before CAMS became really popular and ICE is sort of big. So with that model in mind, let's look at culture and tools. And let's put CAMS. Let's start with CAMS. Who's heard of CAMS? Okay. So CAMS is something that John Wilson, came up with. Stands for Culture Automation Metrics. Gary? If you haven't heard of it, I would suggest Googling for it. You'll see a lot of people talking about it. There's an original blog post, I want to say it's like 2013, 2012. A lot of times it's a nice framing, right? It's a nice taxonomy to talk about that. If you put PMs in the original model, you've got culture and culture, obviously. Right? Automation, pretty squarely a tooling problem, right? Metrics and measurement, that's the M. Pretty much also a tools conversation. Sharing, right? What do we share? How do we share? Is that important? So I talked earlier about CAMS and ICE. ICE came out this year. ICE is another loose taxonomy. Dave Reback sort of came up with it. The I stands for inclusivity. Again, this idea, right, that we are inclusive in some context, right? Even if it's the developers include the operations people, right? It's the core sort of inclusion. But maybe more so, obviously, it's a cultural thing. So it stands for complexity. It doesn't really fit the So let's just do that in its own sort of problem for a while. So why is complexity important? Well, we're coming to the realization that we all work in complex systems. In fact, we all work in what are called complex socio-technical systems because there are human meat bags involved with these, spinning machines that we tell to do things, right? So if we're trying to figure out what DevOps is, then we go back to the original question. Can DevOps work in the enterprise? Can we scale it? How do we spread it? If we want to do what Netflix is doing, how would we even go about doing that? the real key question is, there's an interesting, like, when looking at how to do that, there's an interesting note about complexity. And again, we go back to David Snowden. Complexity. One of the ways to change how people think is to change their tools, right? People heard the story. There's a bunch of them now, but where, some technologist gives their, 2-year-old daughter a magazine, right? And the daughter, like, starts swiping across it and starts crying, right? Because to her, a magazine is broken like that, right? And that may seem kind of like, oh, babies are dumb, whatever, they're learning about the world. But think about how quickly we all went from when we got cell phones to, like, when we off and we just all day I went on my cell phone. In fact, does anybody have this? I started getting feeling like phantom buzzes. Right? I'll pull out my phone and then I could swear that. So that's an example of one of the ways that humans can change their behavior is changing tools and changing how they think. So in that note, I was chatting with a friend of mine about this who's an archaeologist. And he's talking about, artifacts are critical because they both represent and build society, they propagate. And then there's that word that we're trying to figure out how to get DevOps to the rest of the industry and bring it to our team. Right? The way we track cultural and human migration in the region is making artifacts. So I think at the beginning of this presentation, right, tools, culture, and aesthetics, the art of DevOps. Some of you are probably going to talk about art of DevOps. I don't want an art history class. I don't care. I want to know about DevOps. But really, if you look at this, and now that we've sort of looked at sort of the kind of high levels of aesthetics and how they might apply it, talking about DevOps, we really shouldn't be evaluating art, but rather the artifacts of DevOps. What are the things that we leave behind in our organization? What are the tools that we use? To some extent, what are the language that we use? So let's talk about the artifacts of the DevOps movement. I'm not going to go through all of these. Get on time. But some of these are, we'll go through some of these. But all of these things are things that we can touch and see and study and look at. We could, in some sense, excavate them with our team. Right? We could look at what makes these topologies. So let's do that. This is Matthew P. Skelton did a series of blog posts actually on DevOps team topologies. He initially identified 6 of them, right? Through collaboration between DevOps, right? Infrastructure as a service, so you've got kind of the DevOps team more on the dev side, and the ops kind of thing. Fully embedded, kind of like the quarters and the quarters. DevOps as a service, right? I find this really interesting. Right? Temporary DevOps team. Does anybody have that? It's like a temporary DevOps team. I've actually seen that a couple of times. It's not very common, right? But usually it's a good way to have a really broken organization. Somebody else came along. I can't remember his name, but that's great. And pointed out the Google model, the SRE team model, right? Where you actually got SREs and DevOps, and then you've got this kind of weird DevOps collaboration. You don't really have a team per se, as it would. So if we look at that and look back at these, at these taxonomies in the context of team topologies, right? Culture, like how the topology of our teams either foster or discourages communication, right, and interactions. Right? That's obviously an artifact that we could look at. How many people are familiar with Conway's Law? Right, Conway's Law says that systems, organizations are destined to build systems in the same pattern that their communication pathways are. Right, so you've got, I think the example, this was Melvin Conway in the 60s, 70s. The example he gave to compilers were like a good thing. He's like, you've got 14 working on your compiler, you're going to have a 4-pass compiler, 4-stage compiler. Right? And there's a bunch of research on this, and of course it comes up again and again because it turned out he's right. Tools like Bug Tracker, right? What Bug Tracker uses? Email, Slack, people use Slack. Tools for handoffs. How do you handle handoffs between your dev team and ops team? Do you even need a tool to do handoffs? Right? Because the teams are better. So continuous delivery. Let's talk about that as an artifact. So continuous delivery, I'm assuming people are pretty familiar with continuous delivery. Yeah, see the heads nodding. Good, okay. So what I find interesting about continuous delivery, it's really, really big with enterprises right now. In fact, if you look at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, they don't really talk about, like at the summit, they would say, blah, blah, DevOps, blah, continuous delivery for the next half hour. And I think a reason for that is because continuous delivery, like a pipeline, is something you can see. You can assign engineers to go work on a pipeline that you put code in, mix in one end, and like stuff comes out the other end. You can see the pipeline leaking, right? Because it's leaking, right? So it gives a very concrete nature to all this kind of fluffy bunny DevOps culture and stuff. And I think that's why enterprises kind of look at it. Reports back to our taxonomy. Visibility, right? A continuous delivery pipeline brings visibility to what people are doing. Right? If you've got a pipeline and you notice that QA is taking 2 weeks per single commit to test a single commit, that's pretty visible. That may be pretty difficult for your QA team to justify it. They put them on the defensive, right? So that's a cultural aspect to sort of think about. You might end up rearranging some roles if you had a continuous delivery pipeline. Like maybe release engineers don't do the thing that they used to do. Like the thing that I did when I started right out of school as a release engineer, like that job doesn't really exist anymore. Except I would wager actually in really broken organizations that got it. But you know, modern organizations that don't exist anymore. Tools. Lots of fodder here. Tools. I'm not even going to talk about tools. There's a bunch of things to do. Tools. It's interesting from a complexity perspective to consider, is continuous delivery a practice trying to move complex systems into a more ordered domain? Right? I mean, if you think of the idea of, I've got code commits that go in here and then I ship a product that comes out here, if I were able to sort of bound that system with a continuous delivery pipeline, with automation, with scripts that I can look at, and with dashboards that show me the progress of the commit as it goes out, right? Am I making that complex or complicated system more ordered by doing that? It's kind of interesting to consider. So interactions and conversations, right? That again is an artifact that we would look at when we are sort of talking about these things. And actually, I really need to put the phone right. Now, who thought that interaction was awkward? Yeah, it was a little awkward. Now, what's interesting about this is that in a low trust environment, a low trust team, your initial thought is probably, that guy's being an asshole right now, right? In a neutral trust environment, you might say to yourself, let's see probably. You might wake up on one like that. What's going on there? But you might not engage in anything about it. But in a high trust environment, right? In an environment that we want to build when we talk about really healthy DevOps culture, that sort of interaction is going to cause other people to go, hey, what's going on with those people? Normally, they work together really well. And one of the really critical parts of artifacts like that, I just created an artifact, a cultural artifact. Because I yelled at someone and nobody said, hey, that's actually not okay. I'm not okay with it. I left my review later of all of the things that you remember from tonight, and you probably remember that. I've left that as an artifact as part of our experience today. Now, what's interesting about that particular interaction is that a lot of times we see it, especially online, absent context for that particular interaction, absent the context of we have a low trust, high trust environment, it's really hard to know what's going on. Because the context, I keep saying, I need you to put your phone down right now because the server runs on fire. You need to come up and do that. In a high trust environment, you might be curious about that. You might say, oh yeah, you need my help? Let's go. Let's get our gear on and go fight the fire. I'll give you a pretty a very real world example of this. I was working with a team that was moved, they were doing a lot of work in the DevOps cultural arena. They were doing really well. They had a traditionally kind of low to neutral trust environment. They were beginning to build trust. And that team had a rule that for them, they wanted to make meetings really important. So what they did is they said, everybody, the cell phones are actually going to go on the shelf. And this will be no cell phone, no laptops, like we're going to be in the meeting, be present in the meeting, and not waste such time in this meeting. And hopefully it's not that. So one day, I was in the meeting with them, facilitating, kind of just helping them out, what they're doing. And one of the engineers, one of the ops engineers, really good ops engineer, had his phone, right? And nobody was like, hey, your phone on the desk. He kept thinking with it. And we were in the middle of a really big server migration project. Lots of details. We were cleaning up kind of a toxic waste spill with a data center and trying to move it into a better data center that was, I think, very management and all those things. And he just would not stop touching his phone. So we ended the meeting. We all had the plan for the day. We were going to do some pretty heavy lifting, not physical lifting, but getting logical coding and scripts and stuff done that day before the testers that day. And I went up to him after the meeting. I was like, what's going on? Like, we have this sort of no cell phones, no laptops thing. What happened? He's like, I'm sorry. I just had my phone out because my wife had a miscarriage last night. I wanted to go for it. In that kind of high trust environment, when you're doing very serious work like that, do you really think is going to be okay? So as a team, we decided, you know what? We're going to cover all the work that day. And that is the type of artifacts that a high trust environment produces, right? Where you don't go, why the hell are you on your phone? It's something else. Oh, by the way, I asked Jeremy if I could yell at him, and he was good for it. For letting me yell at him. I'm sorry. It wasn't a surprise. So the point that I want to make, though, of that interaction and that story is context is key, right? A lot of times we don't have the context, right? Great example of this that we're all probably familiar with is Agile, Scrum and Agile, right? How many of you do the Agile thing and you're like, I don't want to do the Agile thing. You do the Agile thing because the book says you should do the Agile thing. I don't have any context for why you do the Agile thing. And it doesn't really help you or your team do it, right? That's the poster child for lack of context, but you still do it anyway. Another great example, Netflix is open source tools, right? How many people have tried to use them in their environment and they're like, I don't know what they're doing, this isn't working, right? That's because you don't have their context. That's why their tooling isn't plug and play and fit in, it doesn't fit in for you. So I kind of like this, like a running joke among archaeologists is when you don't know what to use, it's probably cool. So if they find a thing, they're like, oh, it's some religious thing that you should do, right? And there have been a number of cases where, for like decades, they said this thing was a religious ritual artifact, and then they find out and are able to prove later that actually they were like cookie stuff, right? And they just didn't have a context. So context is key. All right, DevOps, aesthetic, tools, culture, and artifacts. Oh my, we talked about a lot of those things. And you're probably like, okay, oh geez, you talked about art, aesthetics, and then you read about the DevOps stuff, and you're quotes, and then you yelled at somebody in the thing, like, what's the takeaway here? Well, 3 takeaways for you. In sort of answering the question, where is DevOps going? Right? We'll talk about that in some of my predictions, but I kind of actually don't care what DevOps is doing. I would find it more interesting where your DevOps is going. And that's going to be individual to each person and to that organization. That's an interesting conversation. In the aggregate, yeah, you can kind of play the 8-ball game, whatever. But hopefully, these takeaways will help you get a sense of where your DevOps is going in your organization. And by looking at those artifacts, then you'll be able to sort of make sense of them. Maybe change things. So, first takeaway, don't avoid the elephant conversations, especially as they're related to shared aesthetics. Slow down to notice differences in aesthetics between you and someone else on your team, or maybe the dev team and the ops team. Right? The quintessential DevOps problem we were trying to solve is ops is like, I don't want to change anything. The dev was like, you guys are always in my way. You guys are always in my way. Right? That is a difference of shared aesthetic about what your job role is. You know John Oswald, Etsy, right? It's one of my favorite books. Oh, that's just dismissively said by everyone who thinks words language and meaning don't matter. Yes, thank you. Hashtag DevOps. So I kind of said this, I kind of got on my soapbox a little bit earlier about this. Pay attention to your artifacts. Understand the artifacts that you produce and that you contribute to producing. So you need to look at them through the lens of this sort of shared aesthetic that we've been talking about. So the things that you do, the scripts that you build, and the interactions that you have with meetings that you schedule, and the emails you write. Like in my 20s, I wrote some horrible emails. Jerk, right? I didn't know you should not be a jerk to people. I had to learn that the hard way, right? But the whole point is do those things that you leave behind, do they contribute to the group shared aesthetic? Does it detract from the group shared aesthetic? By the way, if it detracts from the shared aesthetic, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. A lot of paradigm shifts and pivots and fancy words like that, like organizations move from one state to another, happen because someone pushes in a way that the aesthetic is not shared. But if you're wondering why you're like, hey, let's do chef. You all do chef, and everyone's like, I don't do it. Maybe it's because they don't share the same aesthetic, and chef detracts from that aesthetic. So if you know that, you just maybe need to deal with it a little differently than just jumping up and down saying, hey, let's do chef. And that's a great example of, is it an entirely new aesthetic, right? Is it something totally new to it? And therefore, they have no context, and you're going to have to contextualize it for them. And lastly, keep context front of mind. You have to pay attention to context, or more importantly, your team's degree of context around a particular issue. This slide, well, the line that goes with this slide is, in this context, talking about the unicorn companies that we're talking about aren't particularly useful if you're not Batman with the dolphin arm. But having said this slide has actually become a bit of an experiment, because I show this to certain people, certain groups of people, and they just laugh their asses off. I showed this in Germany. So it's kind of funny, like, the context of my mind. There's a dichotomy there, because maybe this isn't a context that means anything to you. But I can tell you, you show this like at DevOps days in New York or Silicon Valley and that's okay, right? You can say. But most importantly, whatever this process is for you and your team, as you look at your artifacts and discuss your aesthetic, hopefully after this, make time to appreciate the beauty in those things that you do well and that your team does. Okay, so that is the doc. I will quickly go through my, oh, sorry. If you would like a free copy of DevOps Professors, go ahead. I will leave it there, and I don't know if you have a note, meeting minutes or whatever. I'll send it to you. You can shove that in there. If you're curious about reading about Nordstrom and Texas Hot Dog, actually, it was fun profiling Texas Hot Dog too. Some really cool people doing some cool stuff up there. So these are my, since you came for what's happening, these are my DevOps predictions. Prediction number 1, DevOps will continue to disintegrate in 2016. I do not mean like this. I actually mean the technical version of the word. To disintegrate, right? To sort of break apart. So this is a slide actually from another talk, and it's kind of a weird slide again without the context. But the point that I was trying to make is that I gave this talk about halfway through last year. There are a set of people that did a lot of work, and a set of companies that did a lot of work kind of in the DevOps space. And now there's a bunch of enterprises and big companies and people trying to do the DevOps, and they don't overlap a lot at all. There's a bit of a schism there. And in fact, I find it fairly interesting that if you look at most of these people, with a couple of exceptions, they moved on from this whole DevOps. And in fact, most notably, Patrick Baugh was like, yeah, you got DevOps days and whatever, blah, blah, and that's cool. But he's kind of moved on. You know what mobile So part of this is like, when you say DevOps, when you kind of randomly say DevOps, and this kind of goes back to the uniform Batman photo, you might be able to have a really productive conversation in this community about what DevOps is. But if you were to go to like a DevOps Days DC or DevOps Days in Rockies, right, you might find that the things that you're talking about, you might be a little bit hard to concentrate. So these days, DevOps can mean like a new way of working, right? And this is the most common definition, right? People have come up with new and better ways to do their jobs, and so sometimes they just call it DevOps because, you know, I mean, really, Allspaw and Hammond, that way back when they did that Flickr, had that presentation on Kendall for the day, they didn't call it DevOps, right? But that is like one of the quintessential DevOps stories now. And so this idea that people are just doing work differently and experimenting, and let's just call it DevOps because no one knows what that really is anyway, so screw it, right? We can just call it DevOps. Of course, a lot of people are using these self-products. We all know that. So tools, that sort of thing. Docker, even old ones. For a lot of people, DevOps is very firmly inclusivity and diversity in tech. It is women in tech, people of color in tech, LGBTQ in tech, right? That is important to them, right? And they see DevOps as a way to discuss that and have that come board in our industry that we sort of discussed and worked through. And DevOps is the new Agile, capital A Agile or Lean, right? We saw that actually in some of the DevOps aesthetics, right? Very heavy lean on Lean to describe things. Now, I want to make one thing very clear. Are any of these good or bad, or is any one better or worse than any of the others? I don't really know, and I'm not arguing that they are. And I don't mean to suggest that one person's definition is better, or one person's sort of framing of what DevOps is, because what's important for them is better. But language is important, and the fact that you can have a 30-minute conversation about DevOps and then realize you're talking about different things is painful. It's a lot of wasted effort and energy. And this goes back to we don't want to have a manifesto. Was that a good call? I don't know. I'm not actually arguing with you. But I think it is going to spur further disintegration, the opposite of integration of what DevOps means. I promise you, I did not game these slides, but it just worked out that way. So, Dave Robinson wrote, what is DevOps? Also, what you see in 2016, this is last week. Literally today, Patrick Baugh, why do you get TEDx proposal on DevOps? How would you explain it? Right? So I guess there's going to be at least one. Patrick. Prediction number 2. 2016 will be the year of Docker. Who's using Docker? Some people using Docker in production? No? Yes? One yes. Any other yeses? I see one yes. Yes? Yes, in production. Yeah? Okay, cool. The reason I asked that is I tried to find, somebody has a t-shirt. I don't know if it's a t-shirt they made themselves. It is like the Docker logo, but the whale has a frowny face and is sleeping. And like, you just look at it, you'll think it's a Docker t-shirt, but it's actually like a fully screw. And I couldn't find it, but this is the closest thing I could find. So the point I want to make is I think one of the really interesting things about Docker last year, more so, but in what, it's 2 or 3 years before it's coming down the pipe, is there was a lot of really like, this will solve all your problems. Just Docker everything will be fine, right? And in fact, I've been at meetings where people were so fervent about Docker, they would literally shout people quiet that were asking questions about like this. You guys take care of that problem. I don't think it takes care of that problem. They would shout at them until it shut up. Now, I don't think that bodes very well for the Docker community. And my point is with this prediction is that I think more and more people are looking at Docker in a real way, and they are asking the same questions, and it's going to be harder to shout them down. And so you see, last year you saw Bridget Crown Media talk about like what should you Dockerize and what should you like not Dockerize. And being very kind of forefront about like these are certain things that like Docker does not totally solve at all. Right? Docker doesn't necessarily really solve your release engineering or configuration management, that kind of stuff. Right? And I think in the past couple of years it was like it just solves freaking everything. I think this attitude is becoming more prevalent. This is a Twitter poll. Generations get ghetto, yep, and boo-hoo. Were the only two options, right? It's only a sample size of 7, so I wouldn't put too much in it. But I think this sort of points to sort of like Docker to be taken as a serious technology. And by the way, I think it's got some real benefits. I like parts of it. But it's not going to be able to get away with just sort of sliding around like, do you do X? Well, we sort of just shut up, right? That's not going to be a valid answer in 2016. And I think that's going to cause them to be very upfront about the things where the tooling is not that great and fix it. So I think it'll be good. But so I think that'll happen. You see this was actually 2015. Explaining on Docker drawback. So that kind of community is being a little louder. Julian Dunn's a friend of mine, works at Chef. He did a thing. His thesis in this article, which is a great article, is remember how we all used to like work in an enterprise Java shop? Like, you just unzip the WAR file, you just dump whatever crap file, and then you zip it back up, and then you shoot it off ops. Right? Or in ops, like somebody would tell you, hey, you got to unzip the WAR file. You got to put this E file in there and you can sit back up, right? The WAR file became a sort of like toxic dumping ground that everybody shared all over the place. And he makes the argument that if you do Docker the way the Docker community says you can do Docker, we're just going to have a big WAR file like Docker. Good post. You should read it. And finally, prediction number 3. The true complexity of our ecosystems and platforms will continue to rear its ugly head. This is a kind of weird way of saying, I think a lot of times, day to day, we are very focused on like, developers write the software and operations people do the thing, and if you're not one of those people, you support that thing, and you're kind of involved with the process and with all that features, and you make your customers happy, and that's great. And that's cool until somebody hacks you via your HVAC system and all of your credit cards are gone and you're screwed. That's target. Or if you don't like that one, you haven't heard of Knight Capital. That's the trading company that lost something like $46,000 a second for 8 hours. So they lost like 24. Like it went from, hey, we're a cool company, we do trading, to, oh, we lost $450 billion in 24 hours. To, oh, 72 hours, we're like out of business, right? That is a complex system, and I guarantee you every single bit of code and every system that you work on has working in it somewhere something that can take you from, hey, everything's all awesome and cool, to like, we're out of business, or maybe my team is out of business in a short span of time. That is a complex system. So I think those sorts of things are going to continue to like pop up and be like, oh, geez, you have to remember this stuff. So then you might say, well, that's pretty depressing and how I hate my life. Thanks, I'm glad I came out tonight. What's the solution to the problem? I think to combat that complexity, you need to have security people, release engineering people, quality assurance people. I just read a blog post, and I would have taken it if I could have found it before tonight. Probably to it. I read it before. And I just find it again. Funny about how companies are all shifted QA to like their customers. You can just auto-update stuff. So if the thing doesn't work, maybe you'll call us and then we'll fix it, right? QA people writing like infrastructure frameworks and stuff like that. And probably others I'm forgetting. But here's the thing. Those people need to be in the building. As part of your socio-technical system, the way you combat that is you cultivate that talent inside the building. You can't hire a security person with that context that we were talking about for a good half hour as a contractor and get the same result. The example that I'll give you that I find fascinating, and I guess in retrospect, I don't know why I find it fascinating, but I did and I still sort of do. Etsy has a security team. They've got 3 or 4 security engineers that penetrate that, do pen testing, do all the stuff that you'd expect as a security team all the time, right? And that's one of the reasons that they're particularly good at security, because they've cultivated that as a skill within their system inside it. So I think if you want to have any chance of not dealing with complexity, but sort of just living to the ground a little bit, a lot of these things that we've just said, hey, we can outsource all of this, you want to take a second. Okay, so now I'm done talking, and my question for you all, this is the interactive, fun part of the talk. Questions for me about anything, first of all, but also I'm just curious what you all think your 2016 predictions are for DevOps. So questions or predictions? Don't all. You have 2 QA people. Yes. Yes, I agree. So here's the thing in general I find interesting about all of the support roles. So that's release engineering, it's database, it's like DBAs, it's ops people, it's security people, it's QA. If you take a very cynical, very sort of jaded, and I'm very good at this because I'm often jaded, and I break up a little bit. But you don't care. I know. No, I care. Sometimes I care more. But anyway, if you take a really cynical look at those positions, all of those are like no, right? QA is no to the value stream in terms of like, you've got to fix this bug. Release engineers are like, you've got to version your stuff and check it in the right branch, do the right thing. Otherwise, I'm not going to release it, right? Security people are like a whole bucket of them, right? Who else? QA release engineering, ops engineers. So here's the thing. There's this thing called theory of constraints, right? You identify a constraint, but then it moves. You identify it and work on that constraint. Ops people with DevOps have sort of removed that constraint. And they figured out, well, if I become part of the value stream, right, and I get sort of code from DevOps, then that all works out, right? But you've got a bunch of people that, and I count myself among them, that are still sort of kind of in the bucket of no. And the people that I find that are kind of keeping their heads out and going, oh, like I can be in the bucket of yes, are the security folks, absolutely. Because, you know, if you read the Phoenix Project, who's read the Phoenix Project? Go ahead. Okay. Remember where like the security person is all uptight and running all the meetings, and everybody just says go away, and then Steve Bourbon goes on like bender, right? And he's like, my life is horrible, and nobody cares what I have to say. And the answer is, and I say this as really sincere, yes, nobody cares what you have to say, because you're not saying it in any way that's useful, you're not doing anything that's useful. And what's interesting, I have a lot of security friends now, and they realize this whole DevOps thing is like awesome, right? Because they can get into that pipeline. Like if you hit the point where you need to build a pipeline, and then you just kind of figure out when you plug yourself into it, then you're on the side of like getting the water flowing through the pipeline. You're not the valve that is the no valve, right? So I think that realization is coming around basically to everyone that I would call support staff or traditionally support staff. Basically developers in the very cynical, jaded sort of business view, I think. The business view, developers is creating value, and everybody else are OpEx. I gotta write them off. They're just there, right? They're not really creating value. And the amazing transformation that you've seen, both like from a cultural perspective, but also like from a budgeting perspective, They put all the ops people on the CapEx budget. Why? Because they're writing automation stuff. That's not an operational expense. They're actually creating value and know-how for the company. So anyway, that was a really long-winded way of saying, yeah, it is interesting that there's only a few QA people here, and I think maybe that should have been an additional prediction. But I think if you're not an ops person and you're not a developer, and you're kind of like, this all seems scary and gritty, and I don't know what's going on. Like, first of all, like there's a bunch of people in that bucket, but also a lot of people are finding like, if there's an established pipeline that I can like see and talk to other people about, I can figure out how to put myself in there in a way that the business can actually see I'm generating value. And then stuff becomes a lot easier. I saw another hand. Maybe yes. Yeah, all right, I'm gonna write some of these down because you should, right, so more continuous delivery. Any others? Yeah.
I might even say validating continuous delivery. We all kind of agree on it and we see that it's benefits to it, but I think people are trying to see also that depending on who your customers are and the industry you're in, you may not need to release 100 times a day. Maybe it's once every week or once every 2 weeks. And really seeing from the customer perspective their needs, truly how fast it moves.
Yes, so I'll say a couple of interesting things about that. So there was an article in the comments about the myth of speed, right? This whole idea that like if you go faster, you win, not true. Like if you push people faster, like good, not true, right? And so I think that's a very astute point about like continuous delivery argument that really be first, like you can go faster. Is that always what we want? Like I did a podcast with Dave Edwards where it's like, well, if you want to continuously deliver a nuclear power plant, maybe you don't. By the way, your answer was good. You'll find it. Yeah.
As more and more is hosted the cloud,
Yes.
the operations
Is this a prediction?
yeah, operations team will become part of the development team because you don't have this IT organization anymore as much as and the job of the person who works in getting it posted and having it work, the person they would just be part of the team rather than some separate org that you operate.
Yes, I could certainly see that. I think there are overtones of that. I think part of the hard thing about that is what are people's reactions when they hear that? Because my reaction is, if I don't want to be a developer, I'm an ops person, you can set us and get fired.
I see integrated teams, yeah, but answer, really. Yeah.
So I actually have an ongoing, discussion about with a number of people, are people afraid of getting fired? Right? Are people afraid of getting fired if we move everything to the cloud?
My organization.
Yeah. My contention is that people are worried, but I don't know. Maybe this is community, like DevOps community dependent. A lot of people that I talk to in the community say no, people aren't afraid of that. Like they've never met anyone afraid of that. And I'm like, I talk to a lot of people, and like that's kind of the thing I read. You would say something.
It's a combination of fear.
Yeah.
That they don't understand this cloud stuff. They understand physical infrastructure as well. But the flip side is the fear of the as an organization.
Right.
They be competitive, and that's what you do. That fear that they're going to get destroyed. Talk to the top infrastructure guys, right? They're like, we're creating cloud, right? They're creating internal threat. Leadership is a creating external threat. And the point is that if they don't start addressing
Does anyone disagree with that, by the way? Or is that like pretty astute analysis, or pretty correct? I should say stupid. It's a stupid. No. It is a stupid, but I mean also correct, right? And the reason I asked that question is I can tell you, I was doing some consulting with Fortune 50, and that was exactly the conversation. The CIO was like, listen, all of the small, they have a bunch of self-operating companies, like all those CIOs are doing Amazon. And there's actually, if I run the numbers, there's literally no way that I can provide them a vSphere, VMware, blah, blah, blah API thing for the same price. Like, I just can't do it. And so I know I'm screwed. Help. Right? That conversation, I think, is more common.
The flip side is the other kind of,
Yeah.
the other concern is if you put in too much in your team, then leadership guys, at least architect guys, look at it, governance.
Oh.
So the fear in the organization of putting your ops guys in the development team is that governance, right? How are they going to pick the right decisions to have it up like the architect, or it's really the capture, right? Now they're more aligned to the development team who wants to do crazy shit, right? And if they don't have that governance leadership saying, this is how we need to do things the right way. That's the typical corporate governance. Freedom and responsibility, by the way, is the answer. You have to be responsible. If they're going to be crazy, the team has to be responsible for them. If they just throw it over the wall for an IT organization, to be their problem, that's one thing. But if they are ultimately responsible, that's what brings in. Well, I'm going to tell you example that those developers are nuts. And with that upside, that would be nice.
Right. So let me say this about that. So I was a release engineer for a really long time. I said that a few times, and I said it because I'm really proud of my tenure doing that. But I often feel like that wasn't a role that was ever really respected by the organization or most of my peers. And then of course there's this weird dichotomy where like I was banging my head against the wall for years, like getting the version control, and then like getting around and all the developers like, wait, version control is the best thing ever. And you're like, yeah, I was saying that for the last 10 years. Thanks for joining us, right? So there's like a little bit of bitterness there. Little bourbon bitterness there. But what I was going to say is that bring up the freedom and responsibility. I know a bunch of people on what we consider the Netflix release engineering / build team. And what is fascinating to me is they don't really waste any time having conversations about trying to convince people, hey, you should use our Amazon AMI baking tool, blah, 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 for your thing, right? They don't really care if the teams do or don't. But it turns out that when you treat developers and their operations people on those teams, like building the future, you treat those people like adults, and you say, here, I want this feature, and I want it roughly in this time. I'm not going to like dictate deadlines, but I want it roughly in this time. They generally act like adults and use the tools that they try really hard to use the tools because you're not selling. Now, some teams decide to go their own way, and they have good and legitimate reasons for doing that, and they consciously take that risk. But that is that sort of freedom and responsibility part. One thing I wanted to point out before we got too far off it is we kind of went to a little bit of a dark place there about when am I getting fired, like executives are like sparring about should we just cut the whole ops team loose and that sort of thing. It is kind of scary stuff. I don't want to like sugarcoat that at all. But the reason I sort of brought it up and made a point of it is because I tweeted once something to the effect of like, if the only thing you say is no, people will route you, right? They will do their damnedest to route around, right? And as a release engineer, I spent a lot of time saying, no, but, right? No, you can't do that, but here's the right way to do it, right? And it took a lot of work and a lot of like kind of failure really to try to reframe that into, okay, people don't really care about versioning. They don't really care about artifacts, and they don't really care about a lot of the stuff that release engineers are supposed to care about. How can I make what I care about, what the business sort of cares about, easy for developers? Right? And that is the pivot for people that are in that situation. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe everyone here's like, ooh, great economy in the IT space, no concern, whatever. But if that's what I'd say. It's a bit of a retraining. That can be difficult. People want to work with. Yeah.
I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
It's a point that I'm not real happy about.
Yeah.
But I think you're going to see continued monetization of the DevOps phrase for certification purposes and training purposes and who knows what else. It's almost like that they wanted to avoid it by not defining it, but I still think in 2016, as it gets more mainstream, you're going to see a big effort to monetize it.
Yeah, I agree with you. Anybody ever go to Agile conference? Like a week-long, multi-million-dollar. I think it's fun. I wouldn't be surprised if in 5 years, So here's, let me ask you this. And I guess I agree with you. You get that bad. You could,
I think it's bad, but I think things like tonight are common. Right? I think it's keeping it down to what's really being done.
what if I certify all of you? You gotta pay me $20.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't take pal, none of that stuff.
So I don't really think that I don't know if this is a number one of them, but I'm not sure company has created this application that is just a hodgepodge of microservices to deliver a product to a customer.
Yeah.
And they were kind of traditional developers.
So when you say traditional, you mean they have not done microservices?
Correct.
Okay.
So they're just lost, right? They
Yeah.
needed a level of DevOps to kind of even help them understand how to deal with, 5 big services and this, open source application.
So who built the microservice stuff?
Just like it's like one of those falling out rather than kind of things that you put the microservices together.
They're like over the wall, good luck, have fun.
Well, yeah, and so I think we'll see that there will be some requirement of DevOps that you're going to be these kind of microservice issues that are going to start popping up. And then what I also wonder is maybe not 2015, but maybe towards the end, if microservices actually get better, could you have product delivery by service orchestration rather than development?
So I think I think you're right. What I would say is I'd actually broaden it. So you try to build any application, any useful like Netflix, right? Netflix is microservices. Watch every damn good architecture, right? And but I don't think if you talk to any engineers or anybody who would say it's a simple architecture. So one of the people actually DevOps they often say, I think it's a great quote, they were like, operational pain, it was like the second law of thermodynamics only works. It's like operational pain is never destroyed, it's only created and moved around. Right? So this idea, so I would say that definitely is true, but I don't think it's solely microservices. I think anything that introduces a level of, not a level, but a layer of complexity that we are not used to dealing with as developers, right? So when we're all writing a monolithic application, we kind of had the same problem. Like how many times have developers written like .NET or Java applications where you do like the JNI remote calling and then the API changes blow up anyway, but it's a lot of what the application is, right? It's sort of this microservice monolithic thing, right? So I think anything, microservices included, but other things that sort of change the way that we've been trained to deal with complexity is going to cause us to have to actually come up with a framework to think of it differently. And I think DevOps is like a framework to do that. There could be others, right? But yeah, that's a good one. I like that. How are we doing on time? I'm happy to keep questions, other predictions. I'm happy to keep chatting. Yeah, we have a raffle. Yeah. But any other questions? Were there any questions on the presentation? Yeah. Oh yeah, you want to do the raffle? All right. Well, yeah. Yes. Yes. 2 questions. Yeah, or 1. Ask me next year. And I'll tell you why. Well, so that's an inside joke. In fact, the reason this is not on Thursday, the reason this is on Tuesday is because on Thursday I'm flying to Sweden to start my master's program in systems, human factors and system safety. So ask me in a year and I'll have a better answer for you. Having said that, this is what I would say. I think, so remember how we all had like web services and like websites? It was like, this is all great, and you can update them, and nobody really harmed them. Maybe you can get your credit card stolen, but no big deal, blah, 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 right? And hey, it's just JavaScript dependencies. Who cares, right? I think when we go to Internet of Things, like being able to do configure, make, install, if you don't know what I'm talking about, like being able to do those things will become valuable again in the Internet of Things because you're not going to run JavaScript on your poster. Right, exactly. Or you'll have like, half of your toast because it's truncated to floating pointers and whatever. But anyway, I think IoT put some really interesting constraints. So you saw mobile developers like all complaining that mobile is not like web. And it's like, well, yeah, because a phone is not a web browser. Good job, right? But they were complaining like, I want to do all these updates as quickly as I can do it on the web. IoT, I think, increases those constraints even more. And so when you're talking about, hey, my insulin pump has Bluetooth, that's a great idea. By the way, that's a thing that exists. Right? The question I always like to ask, actually, and you can do this. So most of your TVs have OpenSSL in them. And they have OpenSSL in them because HDMI uses encryption like an unencrypted thing. And most TVs, if they're following the license, somewhere buried in the menus, they got to give you the actual GPL and the OpenSSL license. And usually the version numbers in there, look at the version of OpenSSL. And then you'll be like, oh, great, what version of OpenSSL and all these libraries that are like horribly off, like you found out they were horribly automated, or like you stuck in your poster, your refrigerator. What?
Well, it said my videos can be compromised.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, there was a story. So it's funny. 2014, there was a story about a botnet of refrigerators. It was like, oh my God, the world is ending. And then they did some more research, and they were like, the security company that did that report was unfounded, and it wasn't really true, blah, 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 blah. Then in 2015, I think it was Samsung refrigerators were spamming people with leaking email credits, right? So it's almost like DevOps onion. Like the year before you see this stuff and you're like, it can't happen, right? Everyone's like iRobot, or no, Mr. Robot. Mr. Robot, oh man. So good, and the reason it's so good is because you see all this stuff, and now I'm just like, yep, that's totally. When you start talking to security people, you're like, yep, we're all screwed. It's all self-driving cars. Yep. Oh yeah, the Jeep. Yep. Yeah. Exciting times. Woo, DevOps. All right, well, thank you very much. You ready for the raffle? All right, thank you very much. Thank you. Couple quick things. Next thing up is on the PA, some audit stuff. We're going to try to do a DevOps phase here in Dallas. But there's been a DevOps phase. Everybody should go to a DevOps phase. We're in Austin, we're going to try to do it in Dallas. But we need people's help to pull that off. It's not easy to do. So if you're interested in presenting, helping out, volunteering, whatever, get in touch with me, get in touch with John, people in the organization to keep involved in that. There are also the people that some of the speakers like John, Paul, how does it go? But I will point out, so if you're not familiar with the DevOps days, one of the big differences between DevOps days and a regular conference you might have gone to is the way they're typically structured. It's usually 2 days. The morning are talks, so there's 2 or 3 talks in the morning. They do lightning talks, which are fun, right? They're the 5-minute, the slides, auto advanced talks. Excuse me, they're fun. But the thing that I've been to DevOps days all over the world, the thing that people consistently say is the most valuable is in the afternoon they do open space. If you've never done an open space, it's a fascinating exchange. It's usually like some of the best conversations I've ever had have been open space conversations. There's a whole process to invoke and open an open space, but once you get it going, it's the topics are all self-picked by the people that are there and they're voted on, and then you go off to a group, you talk about it for 45 minutes, and if you decide you're not done at the end of 45 minutes, you're talking about it, you are done. And you can do that the afternoon of both days. That is actually, time and again, the biggest value that people get out of that experience, because they get to talk with people like me from outside of their community, but people in their community, about the problem that you all are facing. So it's great. Sorry, I just thought I'd oversell the DevOps days because that's the big thing there.
Also, I want to point out the Slack channel for DevOps. You started this doing it already. You want to start talking to people about DevOps on a regular basis. You can follow that Slack channel there. And there's some other information. So, the first question is, I don't know how you're going to do this. Who has not read these? Who has not read it? I gave you a bunch of numbers. You have promised to read it within a month. Well, seriously, now seriously, that's just what I do. Now you